Welcome, everybody, both in person and online, to the 2025 edition of the Peter Jaffe Lectures on Ending Domestic Violence. My name is Katrina Scott. I am the Academic Director for the Center for Research and Education on Violence Against Women and Children, and it is my pleasure to welcome everyone. At this time, I'm pleased to invite our Dean, Donna Kotsopoulos, to share a few words.
Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Donna Kotsopoulos, and I'm so proud to serve Western University as the Dean of the Faculty of Education. Before we begin this afternoon, we'd like to acknowledge that Western University is located on the ancestral lands and traditional territories of the Anishinaabe, Haudenosaunee, Lenape-Wauk, and Chinookan nations, who have long-standing relationships with the land and region of southwestern Ontario and the City of London. The local First Nations communities of this area include Chippewa of the Thames First Nations, Oneida Nation, and the Thames and Munsee Delaware Nations. This land is also connected to the Township and Sombre Treaties of 1796 and the Dish with One Spoon Wampum. I wanted to share a few remarks about how grateful I am for Katrina, for Peter, and for everyone at the Center for Research and Education on Violence Against Women and Children, CREVAC. To say that it is a tremendous source of pride for the Faculty of Education would be a serious understatement. The work they are doing makes tremendous strides towards understanding and preventing violence and abuse of women and children, not only in our city, but across the country and truly across the world. I am so privileged to work alongside them. Thank you for continuing to organize this important event to recognize Peter's incredible contributions. It is one that we take great pride in and look forward to every year. And I was so delighted to see some familiar faces arriving this year. I also want to thank Dr. Cynthia Miller-Idriss for making the trip up to London to visit us today. I think we bonded immediately. At a time where extremism and polarization are on the rise, we're grateful to have the opportunity to learn how we can all work together to combat misogyny and to end gendered hate and violence. It's more than ever, we are in an era where we have to try to not only imagine it, but make it real. I'm so grateful that you would share your insights and experience with our audience and that you would join us here today. So heartfelt thanks for being here with us. Thank you, everyone, and I hope you enjoy the talk today.
It is so fantastic to have such a supportive dean. Thank you so much, Donna. Okay, before I turn it over, I need to beg your indulgence for about 10 minutes to set a bit of history and context for the talk. So first of all, I want to tell you a bit about the lectures. The Peter Jaffe Lectures were established in 2022 as a way to recognize and honor the contributions that Peter Jaffe has made to ending gender-based violence. Among other things, Peter was a founding member and later director of the Center for Research and Education on Violence Against Women and Children. He's had enormous influence on generations of students, researchers, social service providers, mental health professionals, teachers, lawyers, and judges on this issue. Peter retired from the director role in 2021, and we host this lecture every year to honor him and to continue his legacy of shared learning. You'll hear from Peter later today during the fireside chat. CREVAC's work is almost entirely funded by non-continuing projects and grants, this lecture included. If you're interested in supporting the Jaffe Lecture, please consider making a donation. I think about it as maybe going to a movie or a show. Our goal is to create an endowed annual lectureship to honor Peter and his legacy. Now to set the context. At the Jaffe Lecture, we dig into some of the most difficult topics in gender-based violence, and today included, we're going to do the same. Pictured on the screen are Carol, Anastasia, and Nathalie, all women killed in a single day by a former intimate partner, Basil. The inquests into their deaths, often referred to as the Renfrew inquests, concluded in 2022. Of course, these women are only a small fraction of those killed in femicide and mass femicides and mass violence in Ontario and in Canada and globally. There have been other important inquests. The Nova Scotia mass casualty comes to mind, and the Commission, as does the Montreal Massacre, which we recognize on December 6th, on the National Day of Remembrance and Action on Violence Against Women and Children. This is not the first inquest with recommendations for change, but sometimes you need to spend a lot of time working underground, tending to the soil of change before something catches and begins to grow. And with the Renfrew inquest, the many years of work by many people, advocates, survivors, service providers, researchers, something started and hope started to bloom again in a new way. The Renfrew inquest made 86 recommendations for change. The first was to declare intimate partner violence an epidemic, recognizing that whole society, multi-component, sustained responses are necessary to root out this problem. And since that time, 106 Ontario municipalities have come together and declared intimate partner violence an epidemic. That's over 70% of Ontario's population that is now living in a community that has declared that they are going to recognize and prioritize dealing with this problem. These changes are often happening with little or no funding. Other recommendations are being taken up, such as those for enhanced public education, for more training, for the creation of community high-risk committees. There have also been positive developments federally in policy and legislation. After years of advocacy, Canada finally has a national action plan to end gender-based violence. Recent changes to legislation around removing firearms when there's elevated risk for intimate partner violence is important, as are continued actions focused on the need to address harms and chart a path to reconciliation with Indigenous peoples. And CREVAC is doing its part. This year, we put together in our annual report a 10-year timeline of major achievements. And I guess I'm saying this because, it was a lot of work to put together that report, and it was kind of fun. There are versions of it lying around outside, and maybe after this lecture, you can kind of flip through an annual report and take a look. But these things make a difference. They're all ways that hope and progress put down roots and start to push through to make change. 2 weeks ago, the Ontario legislature followed the groundswell of municipalities and recognized intimate partner violence as endemic. And ironically, guess what's happening today? Well, actually, right now, in Ottawa, the House of Commons Standing Committee on the Status of Women is hearing testimony in support of a report and an eventual action plan to address anti-feminist ideology and its impacts on young Canadians' development and mental health. And did you know that after many years of things staying the same or getting progressively worse, this year there were 19 fewer women killed in Ontario to date than in the year before? So hope continues to grow and root and spread, even in the most difficult of environments. Which is why this year we wanted to turn our attention to understanding the relationship between gender-based violence and extremism, what is happening online and what our communities online look like and how we need to lean into change, and the kinds of conversations we can have in our everyday life to address and respond to gendered hate and violence in both of those environments. The soil in our online communities needs tending. And with that, I will turn it over to Margarita Pinton-Perez, who is our community partnership leader and project lead for the Learning Network and Neighbors, Friends, and Families. She is going to introduce our speaker.
Thank you, Katrina. As we move into today's lecture and the conversations it will spark, we want to make sure everyone, both here in the room and joining us online, has a clear way to participate. So, before we welcome our speaker, let me just take a moment to share how we'll be gathering your questions during the Q&A. We'll be facilitating a Q&A period with Dr. Peter Jaffe and Dr. Miller-Idriss following the lecture. For those of you joining us online, we'll be using an audience interaction platform called Slido, where you can submit your questions and upvote the questions of other participants. While questions with higher votes may be addressed first, please know that all questions are valuable, and we will do our best to cover as many as possible. If you're joining us online, you'll be able to use this Slido account, so the information is here. It's pretty easy to join the conversation. You go to slido.com and enter hashtag Jaffe2025, or you can scan the QR code with your smartphone camera to join. So this is an option for those who are joining us online, but also for those who are in the room, you're also welcome to do the same, scanning the QR code, or you may also access the microphone that's located here in the center aisle. And now it's my great pleasure to introduce Dr. Cynthia Miller-Idriss, our keynote speaker for the 5th annual Jaffe Lecture. Oops, sorry. Dr. Cynthia Miller-Idriss is an award-winning author and scholar of extremism and radicalization. She is the founding director of the Polarization and Extremism Research and Innovation Lab, PERIL, at the American University in Washington, D.C., where she is also a professor in the School of Public Affairs and in the School of Education. Dr. Miller-Idriss regularly testifies before the U.S. Congress and briefs policy, security, education, and intelligence agencies in the U.S., the United Nations, and other countries on trends in domestic violence extremism and strategies for prevention and disengagement. She is the author, co-author, or co-editor of 7 books, including Man Up, The New Misogyny and the Rise of Violent Extremism, which you may be able to see here outside in the lobby, which was published this year in September 2025, and also the author of Hate in the Homeland, The New Global Far Right. She is currently at work on a new co-authored book on evidence-based prevention of hate-fueled violence. Today's lecture is on the topic of gender-based violence and violent extremism. Please join me in welcoming Dr. Cynthia Miller-Idriss.
Yes. Thank you so much for being here. There's so many different people to thank. CREVAC for the invitation, Western for hosting, Peter for having a lecture named after you to begin with. It's such an honor, and I've already had such rich and intellectual, rewarding conversations yesterday and this morning with so many people in and around the CREVAC circle and the team, and I'm just really honored to be here. I'm going to see. Okay, so I'm going to draw on the arguments I make in the new book, but I have some broader things to say as well. And I want to start by saying that I have found that being annoyed turns out to be a really good motivation for writing books for me, and this is the second time I've written a book because I was annoyed. And so I thought I would explain a little bit about where that annoyance came from in my career and why it is I felt it was time to write this book on misogyny. Rather belatedly in my career, I will say, I opened the book with an apology to the field of violent extremism and violent extremism prevention practitioners for not having really done this earlier. And so I think I have to own some of my own blind spots in the field as well. So I'll say, just for those of you who don't know me, I spent the first 15 years of my career working in Germany on school-based responses to resurgent hate and violent extremism there, neo-Nazism and anti-Semitism. I was a comparative education professor. I did not think that I had real relevance to the world of policy or practice in the US or in the English-speaking world outside of the world of other comparative education professors who were interested in those kinds of things. And then eventually I became an expert on iconography and symbols because German youth were coding and recoding symbols and images and putting them into clothing and using logos, and schools were dealing with that with bans and school bans and dress codes and trying to figure out what they could wear. Kids were then making Velcro removable things and turning them upside down. It was a lot of game playing. And so I started studying that, wrote a book, I call it my t-shirt book, called The Extreme Gone Mainstream, about the clothing that was being sold and marketed at that time in far-right scenes. And then Charlottesville happened 2 months after I turned in that book. So I had become this expert on global iconography and youth culture at a moment when the Unite the Right rally in Charlottesville, Virginia, had dozens of young men wearing khakis and polo shirts, unmasked, carrying tiki torches, and saying, "Jews will not replace us," in chants as they walked across campus. That launched a kind of much more belated mainstream awareness in the US and probably elsewhere to how these issues were evolving, and that neo-Nazis didn't necessarily look like the neo-Nazis of the past. And so eventually I wrote Hate in the Homeland because I was annoyed by the questions I was being asked by American policymakers who were at that time very much embedded in ISIS kind of Islamist religious-based extremism thinking around how violence evolves, how it works, that it's ideologically bounded. They would ask me things like, what's the chain of command in these groups? And I would say, well, let's talk about Discord servers and how conversations happen with memes. And so I wrote Hate in the Homeland to explain how the spaces and places where young people encounter hateful ideas have evolved and what it looks like. And during the course of what happened after that, the much bigger public engagement opportunities I had and more testimonies and briefings, et cetera, I became a columnist, a public columnist, and I've done a lot of media. And again, found that the questions I kept pointing out and had been pointing out for some time, some of the gendered dimensions of this issue and the misogyny inherent in a lot of the language of attackers, and their plotting and planning, and it never made it past that conversation. It didn't usually make it into the actual conversation of the report of the media. It didn't make it into the questions I was asked on air. And so I finally decided, I was annoyed, and then discovered this quote from Simone de Beauvoir, which opens her book, The Second Sex, that said, look, it's irritating, I don't want to write this book. And I felt the same way. I don't want to write this book either. I don't feel like it should have to be written, but I felt like I had to write it. And so part of why I wanted to write it is because I came to realize, again, rather belatedly, that there was a false separation and has been a false separation in what I think of as my side of the field, national security and violence prevention, and the interpersonal violence side of the field, which is the intimate partner domestic violence side of things. In the US and in many other countries, those issues are handled in completely separate ways in academia, through schools of social work and education versus schools of public policy and national security, let's say, programs. They're handled in separate agencies, a local law enforcement, Department of Justice versus national security agencies. Often we don't have conversations with each other, as we were just saying this morning. There are so many areas of overlap in the prevention space where we can learn from each other on. But these things, haven't really until quite recently been acknowledged and are still rarely acknowledged on the national security side. I think that people on the domestic and intimate partner violence side have been raising the alarm for a long time about the histories of perpetrators, the histories of violence at the interpersonal level as precursors and as red flags. But people on my side of the field have not been listening. And even though misogyny is a constant across both of these kinds of violence. So I describe this as a kind of invisibility, and as my task in the book and in the work that I've been doing since then to talk about it is of making a kind of invisible visible, making the invisible visible, and trying to raise this conversation so that the blind spots that we have can be fixed. As I say in the book, when I talk about blind spot, it's as a metaphor, a driving metaphor. And as any driver knows, now you have fancy mirrors that will tell you if you have a blind spot. But before that, if you learned to drive before there was a mirror that alerted you, you actually had to look over your shoulder and look directly at the blind spot. And that's how you could see it. So it's not that it's actually not there. It's not like a lacuna or a gap or a chasm or something that's missing. It's something that you can't see unless you turn to look at it directly. And so that's my goal here. The final nudge for me to write this book is that under the Biden administration, they released a new classification system for domestic violent extremism, which for good reasons tried to get away from far left and far right as categories. So there's a column here on the left that identifies all types of domestic violent extremisms related to sort of issues or identity. So you have racially and ethnic motivated violent extremism in that category, but you also have things like animal rights extremism, environmental extremism, abortion-related extremisms, both pro and against. And then you have a middle category that is all the anti-government extremisms, things like sovereign citizens, also unlawful militias, anarchists, anti-fascist extremists are in there. So you end up with things that would traditionally fall on the left or the right. But then that led them to have this category that they couldn't figure out what to do with called all other domestic terrorism threats. And if you can see that text, I know it's a little small, it includes all domestic terrorism threats or violent extremism related to gender, sexuality, or religion. That and personal grievances, which now, that category, reflects the vast majority of all violent extremism in the US. So, the animal rights extremists, I often say, get a category of their own, even though there have been 6 attacks in 14 years, none of which were lethal. We've had over 50 deaths at the hand of violent incels alone in the last few years, a group that I'll talk about in a few minutes. But they get dumped into all other. And I think that othering of gender and sexuality in particular is a metaphor, really, for what's happening. This is all other despite the fact that in the US, and I suspect the data is very similar in Canada, although I haven't seen it, since 1949, 60% of mass violent attackers have a documented history of previous criminal domestic and intimate partner violence perpetration. 60%. That's in a context where well over half of domestic and intimate partner violence is unreported, right? And that doesn't include things like stalking, harassment, sexual assault, online threats, misogyny, anti-LGBTQ violence. So I will say that when I looked through the mass attacker histories in the US over the last 25 years, I couldn't find any that didn't have some history of gendered violence, of misogynistic violence, not just domestic and intimate partner violence, but some other form. I did, subsequent to turning in the book, find 3 cases: the 2 assassination attempts on President Trump and the recent assassination of Charlie Kirk, although there may have been a gendered component to that. So it's not that it's none, but it's very close to none, right? And we have had this history emerging in a context in which we have significantly increasing domestic violent extremism in the US and globally, particularly across the West. More participation from women, which is something I want to talk about, an ongoing crisis, as it's called, in boys and men's well-being. I'll talk about that in ways that create vulnerabilities to some of the propaganda they encounter, and a number of other LGBTQ and gendered motivations that have created a kind of toxic stew in which gender, misogyny, and gendered violence are often mixed up with violent extremist attacks and motivations, but rarely acknowledged, right? So even we had this summer, for example, the assassination of Minnesota Congresswoman and her husband and the attack on 2 others, that was widely referred to in the media in the US as an attack on progressive politicians. I'm not sure how it was reported here. But they were attacked because of their views on abortion, and as allies of LGBTQ communities, Planned Parenthood clinics were also on the list of targets for those attacks. And it's never been reported as anything related to gender, right? So there are often gendered motivations, even when the targets are not clearly identified in that way, and even when the targets of the violence themselves are racial or ethnic minorities, there are often gendered or misogynistic motivations built in. So I'll talk about that as well. So my argument is that gender and misogyny are foundational to extremist mobilization, to violent extremism, and its outcomes in terms of mass violence, and that we have to see these interconnections between interpersonal violence, domestic violence, intimate partner violence, and mass violent mobilization as inextricably intertwined in a much more foundational way. I won't spend a lot of time talking about the US cases. I want to talk more about the global cases, but just to say cases you may be familiar with, often which are not identified as having any kind of gendered background. In every case, I found that they had some sort of gendered background. So the Parkland, Florida high school shooting, which people often recognize, in which 14 kids were killed, that perpetrator, as he was going into the school, praised the incel shooter who had killed 6 people at a sorority in Santa Barbara, California, who later became a kind of icon among violent incels, which I'll talk about in a minute. But because he didn't target only girls and women in the school and didn't leave a manifesto or any kind of indication that it was actually an incel-motivated attack, that connection wasn't reported. So we often see those kinds of connections. In Annapolis, Maryland, a newsroom attack that was written off as a kind of workplace shooting, he had a prior history of stalking and harassing several women prior to his escalation to mass violence. In Uvalde, Texas, where 22 children, I believe, were killed in an elementary school, a horrific attack, he was regularly making rape and kidnapping threats against teenage girls online prior to his escalation to mass violence. And when a journalist later asked those girls, tracked them down and asked, why didn't you report it? One of them said, report it. That's just how online is, right? So the normalization of this as just part of the cost of doing business for young women online in particular, I think, is part of the story here. So again, all of these cases, I want to just highlight one other one. And again, I will be saying some horrible things as a warning here when I talk both about the patterns of violence and some of the things that violent attackers have said. In Charleston, South Carolina, an attack on an African-American church where 9 people were killed who were peacefully worshiping by an attacker who was motivated by false crime statistics after a Google search that directed him to a first hit that was a white supremacist site. So there were a lot of things going on in that story about how the algorithms work and how the search functions worked. Google later corrected that. But while he was in that attack, while he was doing that attack, he said, I'm doing this because y'all are raping our women. So his motivations, again, were never identified as having any kind of gendered component to them, but they were. The crime statistics that were false that he was looking into, that he then was motivated to kill 9 peaceful worshipers over, were gendered, were about false crime statistics about sexual assault. So we see this again and again and again in the Great Replacement conspiracy theory, in obsessions with white women's reproductive capacity to counter birth rates, with direct attacks on women in a yoga studio, here in Toronto, in a van attack, and in other places. It's a constant. This is true globally as well, of course, here in Canada, but also in Norway, in the UK. In Germany recently, there were 2 terrorist attacks, both of which had gendered components to them that were never widely reported, including in Hanau, where that terrorist attacker had previously enacted such violent fantasies against an escort that she reported it to the police, who declined to investigate, and he then escalated into a mass attack that killed several people. So in case after case after case around the world, we see these patterns emerge. We also see that, so I will define incels, for those of you who might not know. That is a word that refers to involuntary celibates. It was originally started as a self-help group online that had no violent or misogynistic intentions. Its founder was a woman who was forging community with other people who were unable to form intimate sexual relationships, find dating partners, but it was quickly taken over by violent misogynists who have turned it into a kind of ideology of its own that is very angry at both women and also at men deemed to be the ones, the 20% of men, they argue, this is pseudoscience, are taking 80% of the women through their kind of alpha male success. And so incel forums, some of you will be familiar with through the success of the summer program Adolescence on Netflix, which had some falsehoods in it that I can correct, like the 80-20 theory that is not true but cited as science, or it's a false claim. So incels, there are large numbers of users on incel-related forums, mostly that are in English, but the members of those forums who are registered are all around the world. So I point this out just to say this is not only an English language problem, although most of the incel-related attacks that have been identified are in the US, Canada, the UK, and other English language countries. That doesn't mean they're not happening elsewhere, they just haven't been identified as such. I want to point out that we actually do a pretty good job of pointing out this connection between gender-based violence and violent extremism when it comes to Islamist terrorism. So there, the International Criminal Court and the UN have over a dozen reports extensively documenting this connection. And we have wide public campaigns, including championed by people like Michelle Obama and others, to raise awareness of the plights of the Nigerian schoolgirls, for example, or the Yazidi women. Maybe a little bit lesser known, the fact that Al-Shabaab uses forced marriage as a tactic of territorial control, for example. The sexual-based violence perpetrated by Hamas in Israel on October 7th. I mean, these things are widely known, discussed, and acknowledged. And yet, when there are reports, anecdotally at least, from journalists who have handed me field notes and affidavits in the US, but also journalists reporting in Europe that white supremacist groups have also run sex trafficking rings, prostitution rings, those things are not considered part of the ideological or tactical or strategic motivation of groups, but as a sort of side effect and not really considered to be a part of it. So it's not that we can't see the connection between exploitation or gender-based violence, intimate partner violence, and harm, gender-based violence on an interpersonal level, and violent extremism. We certainly know it happens. We're just unable to see it when it comes to domestic violence and domestic intimate partner violence and violent extremism on the domestic side. It's a true blind spot in our fields. So what I want to talk about now are 5 strategies that I argue make up a suite of tactics through which gender and misogyny mobilize violent extremism, that help paint this picture of the connection between the domestic and intimate partner side, the interpersonal violence, what we sometimes think of as private violence, and more public violence, these two sides of the field that I often talk about. And first, I should say how I define misogyny, which maybe I should have said right at the beginning, because the word misogyny in English is often colloquially used as hatred of women, and I don't use it that way. I think hatred of women is part of it and can be part of it, but I use misogyny the way the philosopher Kate Mann uses it, which is to say it is the law enforcement arm of the patriarchy. So if patriarchy itself is a system of power distribution, it's upheld by sexism, which is a set of attitudes, and misogyny, which is a set of behaviors. The reason why that's important to think of it as gender policing, of the policing of gendered norms and expectations that are seen to deviate in some way from patriarchal norms, is because it means that women do it as well as men. It means that boys can be subject to it as well as girls, and men as well as women. Now, women bear the brunt of the violence and the harms that come out of that, there's no question. But it allows for this more expansive understanding, and by looking at that more expansive understanding, I argue we can also see a broader range of tactics and strategies that mobilize mass violence. So this is how I argue it happens: through containment, through punishment, through exploitation, through erasure, and then through the enabling support of white women when it comes to the white supremacist side of things. So I want to walk you through a couple of those strategies. I'm looking at the time to make sure, but you'll let me know. Containment, and this is the phrase that was lobbed regularly against Hillary Clinton throughout her time in public office, but also running for election. I start this chapter with an analysis of my own hate mail because I came to see a pattern, probably also gave me a bit of cognitive dissonance from the hate mail, but I started to see a pattern around the time that I saw that this guy on the lower right-hand side left me 2 voicemails. And I should say I'm often misidentified as either trans or Jewish. So you'll see anti-Semitic references in here and also anti-trans references. But he left me a message after I was on CNN talking about the attack on Nancy Pelosi's husband that happened in her home. And he said, you know, why is it that you transsexual people are always front and center on the news? And he went off on this rant that was really about the front and center. And I thought, why is he so upset that I'm front and center? And then about 10 minutes later, he hung up. And about 10 minutes later, he called back and left a second message on my voicemail correcting his anti-trans hate with regular misogyny after he'd done a little research. And he said, looks like I might have been wrong, right? And then he had to leave a second message. He couldn't stand that he was wrong. Anyway, the second message got more sexualized, which is also kind of interesting. But I realized that pattern, and he was also upset that I was in front and center. Why am I on the news? Why am I the one explaining this? And I realized that there's this pattern. It's kinetic. There's motion in almost every email that I get or voicemail. These are all quotes. You know, I'd like you to jump off a building, go back to Russia, go back to the shithole, go back under the rock you came out of, stay in the shadows, go rub your hands together elsewhere. And one of my personal favorites, this guy who said, I'm asking you to get out, in all caps, without saying where I should go to. It's quite polite, actually. Like, I'm asking you to get out, but not actually identifying where I should go to or how or when. And so I realized there's a lot of motion in these hate messages that also align with things like lock her up or send them back, which were the chants lobbed against for congresswomen of color, get back in the kitchen, go back in the closet, right, to LGBTQ folks, that these are common messages. And so I came to see that as a kind of hallmark of what I call containment, which is a strategy to try to keep women and LGBTQ folks in their place. And I use that, and I'll talk a little bit about how that ordinary expression of everyday forms of misogyny, containment, can open up pathways to more violent extremist trajectories. But before I do that, I also in this chapter talk a little bit about boys and men. and why it is that they might be vulnerable to some of the messaging that I'm going to talk about. And sorry that some of the font here got wrapped around a little bit on this screen. I think it probably is on the big screen as well. And so I spent a lot of time, and I've interviewed boys and men my whole life in and around violent scenes, and I will say it's important to acknowledge that they're not just the predominant perpetrators of violence, they're also victims of violence at the hands of other boys and men in particular. And they live now in a culture that, of course, rewards dominance and aggression as hallmarks of masculinity, what's known in the men's wellness world as the man box or man box culture, and have often described to me things like having spent their adolescence surviving a kind of gauntlet in which they carve off bits of themselves in order to stay safe from the homophobic bullying of other boys, and then land in their 20s, and as one of them said, and now suddenly my survival strategy is called toxic masculinity. And so the frustration of having created a survival strategy that then has lent itself to not really fitting in this moment of being able to talk more openly, and then encountering influencers who say things like, men are suffering and I'm the only one who will talk about it, as Andrew Tate does in every single video, right? And so you can kind of understand how some of that pull comes. We also have data that shows there are tremendously high levels of isolation and loneliness among boys and girls, but slightly higher for boys. High levels of depression. Men in the US have, for example, 3/4 of the deaths of despair, it's called, which are overdoses, alcohol-fueled deaths, and suicides. And I just heard that for the first time, Gen Z young men have a higher suicide rate than older men now in the US. So that's not helping the vulnerability side. But there's no reason why a so-called crisis of manhood or masculinity would become a crisis of misogyny, except for how online worlds work. I think that's where we have to understand the exposure that young men have right now to extraordinarily anti-rights, anti-feminist discourse and language, and to a lot of scapegoating of girls and women as the source of their problems. So the result of that right now is that we have a generation of young men who are less likely, this is the US data, but I suspect it's similar here, it would be interesting to know, less likely than older men to say they are feminist or support women's rights. So the data is going in the wrong direction of what we typically think of as change over time. And we also have, let's see, why did that jump to that one? Hang on one second. Yeah, we've got a problem with the slides here. Hang on, let me see if it repeats. Hopefully we get back to where I was. Okay, well there was another point there that says not only are they less likely than older men to say they're feminist or support women's rights, but there's also a growing gender divide between Gen Z women and Gen Z men on these issues. So Gen Z women are more likely than any other generation of women to say they are feminist or support women's rights, and Gen Z men are less likely than older men. So it's a cleavage, a significant divide on gender, including through the kind of content that they receive. And so, one of the things I interviewed an 18-year-old this summer, a young 18-year-old woman, for a podcast that came out alongside this book called Man Up. I highly recommend, where I get to talk to a lot of people about the issues raised in the book, including teenagers. And she said at one point in the interview, she said, it's the strangest thing. My parents had all these friends, like of the other gender, who were, I don't have a single straight male friend, she said, and neither do any of my girlfriends. And, I couldn't help but think at that time, how important my friendships with men were in high school and college and beyond, and how much of a loss that is. And so we started asking that. We're now asking that empirically in all of our focus groups. How many cross-sex or other friendships do you have with someone of the other sex or gender? And so far it's still anecdotal, but we're finding that to be very true among a whole generation who, she said, the only time boys and girls spend time with each other is if they're dating, but otherwise it's completely separated in her high school. And so I think that contributes as well to a kind of ongoing lack of understanding. So there were some slides missing here, unfortunately. Let me just see if they might be further beyond. No, okay, I'm just going to tell you about the rest of that chapter. Somehow we lost a couple of slides here in the transition. So in the chapter I talk about 3 pathways that connect young men in particular from these everyday forms of misogyny that I call containment to pathways that can lead toward mass violence, but I would also argue toward intimate partner or interpersonal violence. One is online gaming. So it's controversial because 1/3 of the world's population are gamers, and it's really important to say that it's not the games themselves in any evidence that shows, there's no evidence in years of research that the violence in games actually contributes to violence in the offline world. But there is increasing evidence that the online chats, the in-game chats where people spend time, the live chat feature, which connects you to other strangers around the world who are gaming, that has an impact. And one, there are deeply misogynistic chats, deeply racist chats, and they're often racist and misogynistic in the context of an affective and fun space where sometimes boys land, for example, on Discord servers, which is a gaming community-related online platform, because they might be searching for tips on how to improve their game. And so they're also getting advice, but in an environment where there's a lot of toxic things going. So I call those incubators of misogyny. A second that I talk about in that chapter are memes and short-form video, which is a way of contextualizing a lot of the misogyny as just a joke. And dismissing it as, anyone's criticism of it as an overreaction on the part of sort of triggered mainstream snowflakes. And the third is the self-help search. And this is the part that I worry about the most and that we see where we're seeing the biggest effect, which is young men typically search for one of 3 things. It's dating advice, ideas on how to get rich, or fitness, right? So how to get fit. And they land on an influencer or influencers by searching for that, who often provide them with very tangible and useful advice, 12 steps, as we know from some of these, on how to get your life together, which starts with making your bed and drinking 8 glasses of water and getting to the gym, right? Things that actually do tangibly make you feel better, but that also really then come very quickly with advice on scapegoating women to blame for your problems, but also tangible guidance on how to exploit women for profit, for sale, how to control them, how to isolate them from others in order to get kind of a leg up on and regain control and get your life together and get to be the alpha male that it is said that women want in a world in which dating is seen as transactional. And that's the way this is described. And so you have influencers like Andrew Tate. Andrew Tate, a lot of people know who he is. And there's, can be an overemphasis on him because there are thousands of guys like that out there. But Andrew Tate is a self-described misogynist influencer who's on trial for rape and sex trafficking for having exploited women and runs dating academy tactics, teaching those exploitation tactics for subscription fees that have made him very rich. He has a 20% approval rating among teenage boys in the US and in the UK. 1/3 of boys in Australia look favorably upon him. So he has tremendous appeal. And what boys will often say is they know he's problematic, but he also has a point, right? That's the kind of answer you get. And so we're seeing, and I know we've been talking about, have been hearing here in Canada as well, teachers and parents. We've had mothers come to us saying all of a sudden their sons say they don't have to listen to them because they're a woman, right? Teachers who say, the kids say they don't have to do the homework anymore, they're not going to do the assignment, or you should go make me a sandwich, right? So there's some expressions of real misogyny coming out in ordinary and everyday ways. I will talk briefly about the other chapters. Here in the exploitation chapter, which was the hardest chapter to write, it is the chapter where I talk about the relationship between domestic and intimate partner violence, the documented history, as I said, between domestic and intimate partner violence, but also child sexual abuse and exploitation. There's a Vice piece that came out For example, recently with the title that says, "Why are all the neo-Nazis getting arrested for child sexual abuse material?" It is very common. What typically happens is that there's an investigation toward an arrest for some sort of plot, and then child sexual abuse materials are discovered on devices in the process of that investigation, and it's the fastest way to put them away, so they go away on those charges. We also see groups in particular in the US being broken up and arrested for drug trafficking, racketeering, or weapons trafficking charges. And so we've had several cases of Aryan Brotherhood groups broken up and arrested and sentenced on those 3 charges. But the Drug Enforcement Administration in the US has publicly said, where there is drug trafficking, there is sex trafficking. There's like a 97% overlap in the data between those 2 things. And so when I looked at an affidavit recently for an arrest that happened of a group of neo-Nazis who were broken up and arrested on those charges, the affidavit describes casually that these men were keeping women in a house and selling footage of assaults on the dark web for profit. So sorry again for sharing horrific, triggering information, that was part of how they financed their white supremacist activities. There were no charges filed on what they were doing to the women. The arrests were for drug trafficking, weapons trafficking, racketeering, that cluster. So one of the things I've been doing is talking to attorney generals in the US about why that's the case. What is it about local law enforcement that disincentivizes them from paying attention to, and obviously they can put them away for long enough on those 3 charges. It doesn't add anything. They have to rely on vulnerable witnesses. They might not want to have them testify or feel that it's worth it. And so they can do that, but it means we don't have the data, right? We don't have the data, you don't get the justice, you don't know how bad the problem is. So last year when 63 neo-Nazis were arrested and a white supremacist group broken up in California, for example, the reporting on that, I remember very clearly the exact quote because I was in Europe at the time watching the reporting and the coverage, and the Associated Press reporting had one little line: they're arrested on drug trafficking, racketeering, and weapons trafficking charges. There's one little line in the coverage that said, the hostage negotiation team was also on hand to assist. I thought, well, who do you think the hostages are, right? Like, we know where there is drug trafficking, there is sex trafficking. The hostage negotiation team was also on hand to assist, and that's the only story we get. It's infuriating. And so this chapter, if nothing else comes out of this whole book, other than that my side of the field has to start paying attention to what we already pay attention to when it comes to Islamist extremists and their exploitation of women as part of the operational, financial, and ideological goals of their movements. And we just ignore it here every single time. It's probably the worst anger that I feel about this book is that particular issue. So there's a lot of other things that I talk about in that chapter around the connection that the both spontaneous and systematic use of gender-based violence as part of the tactics of these extremist groups, and how we have to look at that as part of the motivation and the mobilization. I also look here at AI and VR, so artificial intelligence and virtual reality, sexual-based and gender-based violence, which is becoming a bigger problem. So when Meta released its first beta-tested virtual reality game, for example, in the beta testing, a woman was immediately virtually groped. They had to implement a new movement you can make in the game, which is like something like this, which pushes back someone, right, who is virtually groping you. And so, you know, it's worth saying, although those things happen in games, if you've ever had those headsets on and played a game, we do know that there's real evidence showing that there are physiological impacts of being virtually attacked in virtual reality space. Your heart rate races, you get sweaty, there is a response to it. It's not the same as being attacked in real life, but it is clear that there are going to be harms on the gender and sexual-based side in terms of violence coming from these games, and then we have to get ahead of the curve. On the erasure front, on that chapter, I look specifically at the issue of erasing and controlling bodies, erasing and controlling knowledge, bans on gender-affirming care, and also the erasure of curriculum, the curriculum bans and the school-based library bans that have been so widespread across the US. We've had burnings of books in the US, school boards, librarians who've been threatened with violence, and not just that part of the story, but connecting it to some of the Proud Boys and neo-Nazi groups who have also been protesting and showing up at small businesses who wave pride flags, or showing up at bookstores who have drag story hours, and thinking about that connection between those things as well. In the enabling chapter, finally, and we missed the slide, so I'll just say on the punishment chapter, there's a chapter there that really looks at the only side of my field that has paid attention to this, which is good that if one chapter was going to go away, it's in the slides, it's that one. It's the chapter that talks about the violent incels, the history of the men's rights movements that began in the 1970s around child custody cases, alimony cases, but evolved in online spaces in a well-documented way to be much more violent and more focused on so-called false rape crime statistics and a lot of campus sexual violence advocacy. So that chapter takes you into the deepest and most disgusting online spaces where these dating academy tactics are taught and addressed in male supremacist spaces, what's called the manosphere. And it is, thankfully, the one part of the violent extremism space that is pretty well understood and documented. But part of my argument in the book is I put it right in the center of the book and then say, you know, we have to pay attention to all these other dimensions and tactics as well. And I'll just wrap up before I leave you with some hope on the intervention side, I promise. I'll wrap up by just talking about the last chapter where I talk about the role of women, in particular white women, when it comes to the domestic white supremacist movements. So I start that chapter, some of you may remember there was in 1992 or so, right around that time, a siege at a place called Ruby Ridge, and a white supremacist extremist named Randy Weaver the federal government in the US was trying to take him into custody, and there was a standoff, and it went on for several days, and during the course of that standoff, his 14-year-old son was killed outside, and his wife, Vicki Weaver, was shot accidentally by a stray bullet through a door while holding her baby. There was later a lawsuit. The US government was found responsible, and the surviving Weaver family members received a multi-million-dollar settlement. But more importantly for these purposes, Vicki Weaver became an absolute martyr for the white supremacist movement. Her face, there's signs that say, your family could be next, right? This idea that this idealized wife and mother was shot terribly through a door. And then I fast forward to Ashley Babbitt, who some 30 years later was also shot by a door by federal law enforcement in the US, but this time she was breaking one down, which was at US Congress on January 6th. And she was a veteran, she was not a mother. She was a totally different mobilized woman in support of the movement, of an extremist movement, and was also immediately martyred and made into memes and flags and signs and posters. And so I use that to talk about the difference between the kind of early idealized role of a mother and homemaker, of the homeschooling mother, who picked berries and sold them at farmers markets, essentially, is Vicki Weaver's support, and Ashley Babbitt being a much more violent participant in her own right, and how that traces some of what's happened among women's roles in these movements. I also look at social media, and this is the what's called the White Baby Challenge, which was a challenge issued by a white woman influencer, a white supremacist influencer online, who urged other white women to have as many white babies as she had had, which is 6, in order to counter demographic change. So what you have there are a suite of kind of online influencers who offer kind of relatable kitchen type of content, but infused with a lot of white supremacist ideas around purity and homeschooling and rearing white babies. And then I talk a little bit about adjacent movements like the trad wives that are not exclusively white supremacists, but sometimes used to recruit and radicalize women by white supremacists. One of the interesting things I'll say about the trad wife content, which is young women promoting kind of a homesteading life of rearing a bunch of babies and cooking and often in their kitchens, is that there's good research showing that for some of the biggest accounts, about 80 to 85% of the followers and subscribers are not women, but men. And so the trad wife content itself kind of fuels a certain kind of fantasy and is not necessarily radicalizing women, but contributing further to a kind of gendered narratives that some men are holding. So if part of the challenge, as I opened with, is the othering of gender in the field of violent extremism work and prevention of violent extremism, what would it look like to center it? So about a year ago, the lab that I run launched a new portfolio of work on preventing gendered violence to try to look at these issues. We have a mapping online misogyny project. We have a global project with the Christchurch Foundation that looks at the connection between gender-based violence and violent extremism in 3 countries, and Canada is one of them. It's Canada, Jordan, and Kenya. We have a program on men and boys that mostly works in middle, high school, and universities. And we have a program on LGBTQ and anti-LGBTQ, anti-trans issues as well. We do a lot of work with parents directly. And grandparents, who we find are often even more effective interlocutors than parents on these issues for lots of reasons around parents and teenagers and hostility and challenges talking to teenagers. But we have a lot of guidance that urges people to have conversations early and often with teenagers in their lives about the content that they see online, to think and talk through how that might be shaping their ideas about becoming a man or a woman in the world, to try to do that with curiosity rather than judgment or shame, which can be very hard for parents. And that puts kids in the position of experts. So asking kids to teach you, this is why grandparents do it particularly well, because it's so authentic sometimes, to teach you like, how does a meme work? How can you change it? Explain how Instagram works. What are those symbols, and what is a story, right? So asking kids to explain this, and I've done this a lot with teenagers, can really start conversations that allow you then to open it up. Like, how often does content come across your feed that you don't want to see? What can you do about it, right? Can you report it? Do kids report it? What do you do about how it makes you uncomfortable? I have these conversations all the time in high school classrooms. One of the questions I ask them is, how often do you see something that you think your parents wouldn't want you to see? And I gotta tell you, it's all day long. I also ask them, did you ever tell an adult about it? And only in 2 cases, and hundreds and thousands of kids, have I ever had a kid tell me they told an adult. One told her brother, and the other told another trusted adult. And in both cases, they lost their phones, which is why they don't report, right? They're afraid they're going to lose their phones. So I will just tell you the story that I often tell at this point, which is that I was in a high school in March, or very early March last year, like first week of March, and I started having this conversation, and a girl raised her hand and said, "Oh, you're talking about like what happened last week on February 26th." And I said, "What happened on February 26th? I'm in this field. I didn't know what she was talking about." And she said, "Well, that was that day that our Insta feeds were full of like all this violent content, and we couldn't get it off." And so I said, "Well, what kind of content?" And she said, "Well, like live suicides and murders and child abuse and animal abuse." And it went on for 24 hours, and they couldn't get it off. And so I look it up right there. And sure enough, Meta issues an apology. Reuters reports Meta issues apology on February 27th for the error in the algorithm that led some users' feeds to have extraordinarily violent content delivered to them yesterday. CNN reports it in an even worse way as Meta fixes the algorithmic error. Like, they're the heroes of the story. They fixed the algorithmic error that led some users' feeds. But all those kids in that room were nodding. And none of the adults, the teachers or the parents in the room, knew about it, and I didn't even know about it. So first of all, the teacher stops the session at that point and said, "Wait a minute, are you telling me that like last Tuesday you saw a live murder over lunch and then you had to come take my math test? And they're like, yeah, that's what we did, right? So that changed the whole conversation at that point into so I asked, well, first of all, how do you deal with that? You know, how do you deal with when you see that kind of stuff? And they said, you know, well, one of them said, well, it's just like that day last summer when we all got the violent porn on our feeds, right? Like they're so casual about this common experience of awfulness that just shows up right in front of them. So one of them said, well, I just, you know, you get kind of apathetic, right? You get pretty numb about it. Another one said he didn't tell anyone about it because he thought it was his fault. He said, I was embarrassed because I thought, what did I look at on my feed that led the algorithm to think I want to see this content? So he was worried that somebody on the bus might have seen, you know, that he had a live suicide on his feed and that it said something about him. So there's some shame here because we taught kids that if you hover over a video, you get more stuff like that, right? If you watch a video all the way through, you get more things like that. The algorithm is learning about you. So he thought it was his fault, which is obviously also not what we want, is to create shame from this. So the more we can have these open conversations, including in schools, about what kids are seeing. I just came from Australia where they have a total social media ban going into effect for under 16-year-olds on December 10th. So a lot of this conversation that I had was about that and, you know, is that the be-all, end-all? And I'll tell you, it's not. It's a great experiment, but in the absence of conversations, we know, A, kids are still gonna get accounts, they're gonna see their 16-year-old older siblings' feeds, and it doesn't include everything. It doesn't include online gaming. It doesn't include all platforms, right? It does include Instagram, TikTok, Snapchat, and a lot of these feeds, but it doesn't include things like Discord. So that's something that might eventually come into conversation in Canada, I suspect. It'll come into conversation certainly in the UK and for the US. But I would argue we really do need to continue to have these conversations. I'll just end by saying that we have a guide, which I know some of you have used here, called Not Just a Joke, Understanding and Preventing Gender and Sexuality-Based Bigotry, that is co-created with the Southern Poverty Law Center, and that I got Princeton University Press to put in the back of the book as a resource guide for parents and teachers and mental health counselors and social workers and others who want to know more about the gendered content their kids receive, the ways that it can open up pathways to violence. All of our tools are free and they're evidence-based and available to the public, and so please have a look at the website and take a look at the guide in particular, but also our other guides on online radicalization and other tools for parents and teachers, and I will leave you with that. So, thank
you. Thanks for being here, and thanks for a talk that was both inspiring and also very depressing. Yeah. And I just wanted to ask you about that first. Yes. How do you survive doing this work? I mean, it's something that I get asked, but I'm looking for answers from others.
Yeah.
As you, obviously some of the things you talk about are so overwhelming and sad and in terms of reflection of our societies. How do you manage that and keep up hope?
Yeah, it's a great question. I'm an optimist by nature, as you probably can tell, and that seems strange in my field. I think that I think I would feel more depressed if I wasn't doing the work I'm doing, because I don't know what else to do except to, for some reason, teenagers will talk to me. And so I can talk to them and they will tell me stories, and sometimes men in and around violent scenes will also talk to me in research, and I can use those to create interventions. And so the things that give me hope, I think, are that we have 30 people now in a research lab designing and creating tools, working with communities, doing incredible work to try to change this. And to be honest, like being here in conversation like this also gives me hope that there's such interest. I never imagined there would be so much interest in a book sitting at the intersection of misogyny and violent extremism, and there has been a lot of interest. I feel like there's a willingness and an ability to see it now, and seeing it is the first step toward solving it or addressing it. So I'm more optimistic now than I was when I was writing it, when I thought I was writing it to understand it myself and to think about how we could incorporate it. And now I feel like there might actually be some chances of getting this addressed. Yeah.
When you talk about hope, and you were talking at the end about some of the encouraging things, would one of your suggestions be to really integrate this into the school system at all grade levels? Like I'm assuming you have a variety of projects, but it strikes me this is something for every student.
Yeah, we have, for example, we have a program for kindergarten through fifth graders that's wildly popular right now. We have it in, I just heard something like 200 schools already, and it just got released. It's in all New York City public schools as part of their cyberbullying week. And that is, at a very young age, starting to teach kids in accessible ways. They're animated characters and videos that teach them how to stay safe online. So, often safeguarding from online harms is a way to get a lot of people at the table and a lot of conversations. I think that it's something that we're constantly kind of a generation behind doing on schools. It is more challenging in a lot of schools to have some of the conversations I think we need to have. Like we're talking about porn literacy around the violent porn issue. That although most parents in research support sex education, it's still a very difficult conversation to have. And to get, people get squeamish about it. And so, trying to have those kinds of conversations and starting to get schools to recognize the importance of incorporating healthy conversations about gendered content and harmful and violent content into health education, into digital and media literacy. And what I often say is, like, we can either have these conversations with kids or we can let the internet do it for us. Like, they're having the conversations, so, if we don't engage as adults, they have very little guidance from reputable sources and a lot of guidance from potential scammers, influencers, and profiteers.
Any reflections on swimming against the tide politically, so to speak? And again, I'm not naming names or countries, but I think it's a challenge sometimes because you'd like to have support from in the field in the highest places possible. But I guess my question perhaps is more: do you find, are there some states or cities can you work at different levels of government for support?
I mean, it's no coincidence that this book tour this fall has taken me to Germany, to Canada twice, to Australia. I'm doing lots of talks in the U.S. as well, but no government briefings this year, right? No, that's just a pause, I would say. So there's certainly, we're in a difficult situation, and I think it can be said, and it should be said that, and I think there's a question here, the normalization of some of this, even in the political climate. When you have a Secretary of Defense in the U.S. who has called for male standards in the military, when we have Mark Zuckerberg calling for masculine energy in the corporate sector as what's needed, and a president, and I just wrote about this in an op-ed, who just told a reporter to be quiet, piggy, right? I mean, the kind of casual misogyny that is normalized by leaders and elsewhere in the world as well. It's not just my country. Is harmful to a context when kids see this stuff online and then hear it echoed among leaders in the corporate and political sectors. At the same time, what we're finding in the lab is, you can't do everything at once, and we're very busy working with states. We're in 7 or 8 states across the country in our regional work, and in 200 schools, and in a couple of cities and counties as well. So we've worked in Texas, for example, not with the whole state, but with a county that was interested in working with us. And so you can work even in places, you might not be able to work in a very conservative state, but you can work at the city level with the mayor's office to build digital and media literacy. We are 100% not government funded right now, and so but philanthropists have stepped up, and so that's also hopeful. We've tripled in size since the election, and I think that's on the, with the gratitude to a lot of democracy funders who have seen this work as essential in strengthening democracy, not just preventing violence, but really building social cohesion and trust.
Just one reflection as you had the map of the world, talking about the problem being everywhere. Obviously, Canada has issues as well. Obviously, it's more dramatic in the U.S. because of the presence of guns.
Yeah.
But obviously, in Canada, actually, our center was founded after December 6th in memory of those lives lost and the École Polytechnique massacre, and also recent mass shooting in Nova Scotia, which actually started with an incident of domestic violence or attempt murder. So obviously we struggle with some of the same issues, not to the same degree. So I think it's important to recognize that as you were looking at the map, and obviously, and also reflecting on a comment that you might want to expand on, that women are at risk, but also men, in terms of taking obviously the mass shooting at École Polytechnique was directed at women, and a mass shooter in Nova Scotia directed at men and women.
One of the data points I didn't cite, but I talk about in the book, is that we also have data in the U.S. showing that in over half of mass shootings in the U.S., a former or current partner, domestic partner, or lover is a target of the shooter. So, everyone else then is collateral damage, essentially, right? Even though, so the rage that's taken out against this one person includes a lot of others. And so, we have a massive weapons problem in the U.S. and gun violence problem, and the number of mass shootings is much, much bigger here. But the gendered components to it, even while maybe the ratio might not be so different in terms of the relationship of gender-based violence to those violent mobilizations.
We welcome questions from our live audience and also our audience online. I see some questions, but we should try to get to your thoughts about the best way to combat the spread of violent incel ideology.
Yeah, that is a great question. I think the best defense is an early offense, for all of this kind of ideology, is early and often conversations that preempt the content that young men see online when they get drawn in. And so what we find, we have a lot of work in what's called pre-bunking, which used to be called attitudinal inoculation in the academic literature, which is really a tactic of media digital literacy that teaches people how to be more skeptical of the media they consume. And we find that particularly with teenagers, that's more effective than trying to argue with them around the ideas or present them with counter arguments based in facts. So it's a sort of three-step process. We do it in short form videos. You identify a manipulative tactic being used, like scapegoating or fear-mongering, or something called transfer, which is trying to get you to associate the iconography of an extremist group with something positive, like a liberation movement. And then you give them a microdose of that propaganda, and then you tell them to go think for themselves. And sometimes we add a 15-second counter-narrative in, which teaches them why it's not true. But we have had tremendous success in reducing. What happens is when young people in particular don't like to find out they're being manipulated, especially boys, and so they tend to reject the propaganda along with the manipulative tactic. That's what happens. And so it reduces their anti-Semitic ideas, it reduces their anti-immigrant ideas. We don't know how long it lasts. The evidence shows maybe about 2 months, but we need more data to know. You'd probably need to continually inoculate people. It's just like a vaccine. It works like a vaccine, a mental vaccine, that before they encounter the ideas. Once you're already down the rabbit hole, then we're talking about something like disengagement or de-radicalization. That can be done. There's a great place here in Canada at York Family Services in Yorktown that has had great success with de-radicalization, but it's therapeutic, it's one-on-one, it's time-intensive, it generally doesn't work until someone's ready to disengage, it's very hard to initiate. So the best way to address that is by really preventing people from believing the manipulative tactics to begin with.
I see a number of questions online around sort of the political environment you're working in and some of the challenges. A particular question about DEI and how things have changed in terms of funding and any reflection, because that obviously goes to the heart of some of the work that we're all trying to do.
Yeah, I mean, the federal funding in the U.S. is 100% gone, totally. There's none whatsoever on any of these issues. So that, and not just the funding landscape, but the expertise, the data collection, the data sets, the surveys that were run on youth and LGBTQ issues by Health and Human Services. I mean, it's just, there's nothing left. And so, researchers, I think, are much more left on our own. As I said, we were lucky that we already had very good relationships with foundations and philanthropists, and so we're able to scale up our work despite that, or maybe because of that, in ways that are really useful. But it's not the case that that hasn't happened for everyone. A lot of people have really been significantly reduced in the work that they were doing if they were reliant on USAID or state money or Health and Human Services or Center for Disease Control. So there's also, of course, and I'm happy to talk about the attacks on universities itself and the pressures. Because we're externally funded, I think, and at a private university in DC, which is a state that hasn't had the same kind of pressures as some states have had on their public systems, we have been pretty lucky so far, but we're cautious, and we don't know what the future will hold and whether we'll be able to stay in the US doing the work. That's something we think about a lot, is do we relocate? And that sounds extreme, but it is a real possibility.
We have a question from our live audience.
Okay. Hi, Cynthia. Thank you so much for your talk. It was really interesting. I'm an expert on social media. I have a lot in common with you. I hope to chat with you more later. But I'm curious what you think about the role of social media companies in all of this. Education is so important. Working with policymakers is so important. But as we know, so much of this stuff is happening on social media companies. So what do you think about their role is? What involvement have you had or conversations with them about curbing this?
Yeah, this is a great question. And I have so many thoughts on the social media companies and their accountability and what they should be doing. I think ultimately, this is probably the place where I have the least hope. And so where I get really pessimistic is in thinking about the platforms. And I think that's why I feel that the place to have hope is in communities and in individual relationships and what schools can do and what families can do and what you can do on your soccer team, where we're seeing measurable impact. But where I get pessimistic is because that can seem like what you're doing is just teaching kids to be more resilient in a terrible ecosystem, right? So our work is very much inspired by public health research over decades, which has shown that, for example, you don't just invest in treating the incidence of disease for cardiac disease or diabetes once it shows up. You also can work to educate communities 20, 30 years in advance of the onset of those diseases about healthier eating habits and exercise and choices they can make that safeguard their families from harm and help their health. But what public health researchers have learned is that you can't only teach people how to make better choices if they live in food deserts or they live in places where there's no safe walking trails and it's impossible to exercise because they're working 3 jobs, right? So you have to look at this broader ecosystem, and that's, I think, the tech companies and the algorithms that we all swim in. And so we need the equivalent of work that's saying, how do we address food deserts, which is how do we, can we make them change the algorithms? And that would require regulation that so far countries have not been willing to do. For those of you who don't know, in many places, including my country, social media companies are not liable for the content that is on their sites, on their platforms, because they have successfully argued that they are not content creators, they're just content hosters. And so by hosting someone else's content, user-generated content, they are free from the liability. So they only have their own trust and safety policies and it's a private policy. It's like having a school dress code, right? But there's no actual law that prevents them from doing anything. So you can be an unregulated platform, you can be an unmoderated platform, and there are platforms out there that are like that. We advise parents about the kinds of platforms, for example, that have no moderation or no restrictions, Mainstream platforms like Meta's platforms, Facebook, Instagram, mostly have some trust and safety policies. But even those trust and safety policies, for example, recently decided misogyny doesn't count, right, as hate, right? So they change all the time and remove certain kinds of things. So we do need more regulation. We're seeing something like what Australia is trying to do, which is create a total ban for under 16-year-olds. So that's one strategy. Another strategy is what Europe has tried to do, which is create a Digital Safety Act, which requires the platforms themselves to be more vigilant about removal of content. But so far, it does not appear that the fines are enough to incentivize actual compliance. So unless there's political will to make those fines stick and to make them enough that they offset the advertising dollars that would be earned from 6 months of showing that harmful content, we're not going to see change. So I do advise the trust and safety groups at all, I have done it at all the platforms, basically, all the mainstream platforms, because I learn a lot in those conversations that help me think about what we need to do on the community-based side. And B, I think the trust and safety individuals, generally speaking, are doing amazing work and really trying, and they make recommendations that are almost never then taken up because it's a for-profit world. So this is where I get super pessimistic, and the only way I know how to be more optimistic is to say, I want someone to work on the regulation, and that can't be me. I'm going to work on the community-based tools and try to help kids and families be safer in an environment that is toxic. So, yeah. Okay, great.
Running short of time here, so
Yeah.
lots of good questions left. Let me deal with one, and that is engaging boys and men. I think you've talked about talking to adolescents and engaging them. I know I listened in preparation for today. I listened to a couple of your talks online, and one of your talks you talked about your husband and your father, and that you're happy to have them in the audience. And so my question really is, how do we get men to engage other men in this discussion? Because even looking at, I don't know the audience online, but looking around this room, we're still, every time there's a talk about violence against women and misogyny, it's the audience is 80% women, and men often aren't present or engaged, or perhaps even avoid the presentation. Any thoughts?
Yeah, I do. So one of the first things I did when I turned in the book in September of 2025. Or 2024. It takes about a year for it to go into production. So I had a lot of time to kind of seed the ideas. And the first group of people, I reached out to a bunch of women, predominantly women who work either in feminist activist spaces or in gender-based violence, domestic violence spaces, because I was worried about stepping on the toes of people who've been doing this work for so long when I wasn't. And so got copies to them and made sure and thought about, and that's how a lot of the conversations, including the one that you saw, which was between me and one of our predominant leaders in the US on domestic violence, Rachel Louise Snyder, in conversation. And the second group of people I reached out are to men in the men's wellness world. And that's a really burgeoning space. Men's health and wellness has been looking much more at the issue of violence, including violent extremism as it relates to the manosphere. And so several of the talks I've had this fall have been with people like Mark Green, who runs the Good Men Project, or Ted Bunch, who does A Call to Men. There's a group up here called Next Gen Men that's doing incredible work in Canada. In Australia, my last book talk at a bookstore was with Zach Seidler, who's the director of Global Men's Health at Movember, which also has a Canada-based group. I think those men and the men running those organizations are the place where I see the most hope at this intersection, because they're really leading a huge and growing movement of men seeking change and advocating for change, and often, and I'll say actually that school that I was talking about with the 16-year-olds who told me about February 26th, they asked me at the end of that conversation if they could start a club at school to talk about these issues. And I said, look, if you start a club, I will come back. And so, in fact, they did start a club, and they invited me back, and so I asked if we could bring Mark Green. So we're bringing, so the two of us are going to go spend a whole day at that school now, because these kids wanted to start, and now they're going to be high school seniors. Absolutely amazing development. And so I think, if you listen to kids and what they want, and then you make sure that there are men and women at the table as adults to help these conversations along, those have been some of the most compelling and interesting conversations I've had, both in schools and with older adults as well. So again, I'm an optimist about this because I find that there are so many good men, right? I would say, like, as I talk about, I lived in a house of 10 guys in college. I was on a cycling team with 50 men and 3 women. I have spent a lot of time in my life around men, and maybe that's made it easier for me to interview men and to talk about it. One of the men I talked to is Jackson Katz, who some of you know from the world of domestic and intimate partner violence, and we have an interview that he did with me coming out in Ms. Magazine this Friday, so we'll talk about a lot of these issues. And so I will just say that I think this book and these ideas are being well received by men in the men's wellness world, and I'm eager to have that continue. And it's a place where I do see a lot of hope.
That's great. Well, again, thank you very much for being here. It's been an honor to be able to talk with you and listen to your presentation. And Katrina, any other closing comments? Okay.
Thank you. Many thanks to Dr. Miller-Idriss for a very thought-provoking talk and really interesting book that we had some conversations this morning. Thank you for addressing the blind spots and for making the often invisible visible. Thank you also for bringing attention to the systemic issues that create and maintain the invisibility. As you discuss in your book, this inability or this unwillingness to see is often rooted in bias. It is dangerous, and it puts us at risk. Thank you also for the hope. When you said you were optimistic, I'm like, yes, as I am as well. So just, yeah, if I can give this to you.
Thank you.
Add the names of the other speakers on here.
Wonderful.
So your name is going to be on there.
Thank you.
All right.
Thank you so much.
Well, that concludes our fifth annual Jaffe lecture. On behalf of everyone at the Center for Research and Education on Violence Against Women and Children, thank you to everyone who joined us in person and online, and of course to our keynote, Cynthia, and also to Peter. For our guests here in person, we invite you to join us for our post-lecture reception just outside in the foyer, just outside the doors. Thank you for coming.